Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who will share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Welcome to American Medieval. We are very excited to be joined today by John Wyatt Greenlee. John Wyatt has a PhD from Cornell University in medieval history. He's also the proprietor and owner of Surprised Eel Mapping. And so welcome, John Wyatt.
Thanks, Matt. It's really good to be here. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, it's lovely. I mean, it's always weird, when we do these episodes, when I'm doing it with somebody that I've known for a long time, because you do have to do that kind of podcast thing, I think, where you pretend like, oh, here's the formal welcome. And instead of just like, hey, man.
Here's this guy. You know who he is.
Yeah, exactly.
Get a load of this guy.
Get a load of this guy. That's absolutely right. One of the things I always get asked about, and so I like to ask guests about, is about time machines. Because I think all historians have kind of complicated feelings about the idea of time machines. And maybe we can talk about complicated feelings about time machines later. But for the moment, if you would, let's pretend that we have one.
Okay.
And you get to go back to tell a childhood version of yourself that someday you're going to grow up to be a medievalist. How does childhood you react?
I've actually thought about this question before, believe it or not.
Okay. All right. Excellent.
But there's a couple of different things I'd like to say here, I guess. The first is that going back and telling childhood me that I would grow up to be a medievalist, I think childhood me would be like, cool. That's awesome. You can do that for a job. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I started reading medieval history. I mean, for kids, right? But medieval history when I was 7 or 8. I just loved it. And I sort of read everything I could get my hands on. And so, yeah, childhood me would have been sweet.
So you started with George Duby in French and normal childhood medieval history books.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, of course. I started with books like We Were There with Richard the Lionheart on the Third Crusade kind of books. Mm-hmm. 7 or 8, right? The little boy. So I really dug the castles and the chivalry and the knights. And I wasn't reading and thinking so much about chapels as liminal spaces on bridges kind of things. But, I got there.
Yeah.
So, I would have been really kind of excited about that. I'd be like, oh, that's great. Okay. I loved history and I loved medieval history. And so I don't think I would have been surprised. Checks out. I didn't go straight from 7 or 8 to being a medieval historian. I was a college volleyball coach for about 10 years. And then I went back to school and now I draw maps for a living. So I think that 7-year-old me would have been kind of surprised at the sort of serpentine route that my life has taken. And
an eel-like route, perhaps?
An eel-like route, yeah. And especially the last 10 years or so where I went to school, which is kind of normal. And I started live tweeting my dissertation basically as I wrote it about eels. And then I got covered by Time magazine and things got weird.
Yes.
So the idea that I could have parlayed what's really a very niche medieval history topic, right? The role of eels in English cultural history from 500 to 1500 into something that has wound up being quite popular and has sort of given me a platform for creating an entirely different career. My ability to sort of find clients for mapping is in large part based on the audience that I built tweeting and about eel history.
Yeah.
So I think younger me would have been really surprised by that.
Yeah.
But not the medievalist part.
Not the medievalist part. Okay. So, and I want to get back to eels, of course, in a minute, but you would mention kind of the things that interest you kind of as a child, the idea that there was a job called medievalist to a kid. I've heard that before and it's something I myself kind of felt the idea that I would be kind of a teacher. My mom was a high school teacher.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of being a teacher was not a weird thing, but that you could teach something about European history or medieval history. My mom was an American history teacher. That was weird. And that's pretty common, I think, for people kind of our age is that, it's not weird if you think about it for a minute that, yes, of course, probably they teach about other periods of history, but that was kind of outside of our experience. The other part too that I wanted to just ask you a little bit more about was you had mentioned kind of the types of book you read. And I remember, like, I don't know if it's actually like the Golden Book of Castles or something like that, but that's what I remember, like taking out from like the local public library.
Yeah, or like the David Macaulay
The David
books.
Macaulay, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
1,000%.
Castle and Cathedral. Yeah.
Yeah, just poring over the details of those drawings and stuff like that. But it's kind of the aesthetics of the medieval, right? Like kind of the vibe, maybe for a better sense of castles and knights and stuff like that. Did you find that that kind of carried through your education? You know, I mean, one of those things too is about like, I thought I was going to play first base for the New York Yankees when I was, 12 years old. That did not happen.
Yet. Give it time.
Yeah, that's right. There's always the future. I think I'm a little bit too old. My knees are not as good as they used to be. And my baseball talent was really poor as well. So that
that got in your way.
That got in the way. Yeah, I couldn't hit a curveball to save my life. So when the curves actually started coming in, that was the end of my baseball.
That was the end of it.
So, yeah, which was, about 12, 13, something like that. So anyway, back to the Middle Ages. But it is American medieval. We can talk about American things. What's more American than baseball? But again, about kind of the aesthetics is like one of the things that's been very interesting about, working on this podcast and thinking about my own trajectory is like how my interest in the Middle Ages kind of changes and how there are certain things that stay the same and certain things that are different. So like, do you find that interest in kind of the visuality of it, because like one of the things you do is like mapping, is drawing and stuff like that. Do you find that kind of has carried through, or it's something that you've kind of returned to nowadays?
I would say it's carried through, but changed, right? Like, so
okay.
When you're a kid, you think about castles and knights and jousting and things like that and hitting people with swords, because as a little boy, I love swords. When I started grad school, I didn't intend to do Eels. I intended to write a dissertation on maps and cartographic history and the way that people think about the space around them and then reproduce it.
Sure.
I tend to think of maps as covering a pretty wide range of things, so like graphically or in terms of text or other things, but I got distracted by the Eels. But like that was where I intended to go. And all of my published academic work is on maps and cartographic history, actually. Here's a distinction that maybe makes sense. When I was younger, I think my aesthetic interest was more sort of focused on the medievalisms of it, right? Like on the way that we think about and reproduce now the way that we want the past to have looked. And that at this point, my interest is much more on the way that medieval people produced like the medieval era and how it looks. So there's a distinction there. That's something that grad school taught me, basically, I would say, right? Like, because I said I coached volleyball for about 10 years, and I left coaching to go back to school largely because I was kind of burned out on the coaching, and I was finding that I was really enjoyed the time I was spending with my players, like in study hall, much more than I was enjoying the time I was spending with them on the court. And one of the things I always loved about coaching was the teaching part of it.
Yeah.
And that's sort of very clearly where my interest was shifting. So it's like, okay, well, so my initial interest in going back to grad school was teaching. And then I figured to deal with the research as it came. And I've come to really enjoy the research and the writing, or at least the having written, but I still really love teaching. And it's also kind of what got me back into grad school. But I would say that like my interest or knowledge about the medieval sort of maybe paused or crystallized a little bit in my mid-teens and kind of stayed there. So like going back to grad school and think, well, I want to go back and study medieval history when I was 35, but without actually knowing quite what that meant, right? Like I'd kept reading, but mostly I was not reading academic books. I was reading popular history books, because when you're just a person wandering around the world, that's what you do.
Yeah. It's what's on the shelf at the bookstores, right? Yeah. Or the libraries. Yeah.
So my sort of thinking about what the medieval was and how we think about it and the context in which it sort of operates in the world today, really not much different than it was when I was 20.
Yeah.
And so like, thinking about sort of that shift in how I'm thinking about the medieval aesthetics and the way that we approach it is a lot of that's grad school training. It's a discipline, and it opens doors in how you think about things, or it should.
Yeah.
It certainly did for me, because it exposes you to people who've done a lot of really heavy, deep thinking about the past and what it means and how we access it and how we reproduce it.
You had mentioned too about like the term medievalism as opposed to kind of medieval studies, which there's a really problematic kind of relationship between them, and they're more interrelated than oftentimes scholars certainly make them out to be. But I think like understanding that there is a distinction between how people remember the past and how people in the period themselves are thinking about their own time, that's really important. And scholars are kind of, complicit in kind of eliding those two things sometimes. But I think that's also really important and a really interesting thing that a lot of good teaching will kind of bring out, not just only at the graduate level, but at the undergraduate and even, of course, at K-12 level as well. It's not just how we think about the past, it's that there's a distinction between that and what people themselves were thinking about the past.
Yeah.
One of the things, for example, like just to bring it back kind of the maps for a second, is like conceptions of the world, like the way that people drew maps, is that one of the things that I was blown away about, I very distinctly remember, is like that there were medieval maps
Right.
that were drawn in the Middle Ages, and not, like kind of nice kind of borders of Europe kinds of things, but like different types of maps. So maybe just to ask a kind of a generic question is like, what's your favorite medieval map?
Oh, okay. I have a pretty pat answer for that, actually.
Excellent.
So my favorite medieval map, it's a map of England by a guy named Matthew Paris, who was a monk at St. Albans.
Okay.
He lived in the sort of first half of the 13th century. So he died around 1257 or so. And he drew 4 different maps of England. They may be the first regional maps of just about anywhere in Europe that we have. So rather than like drawing like the world, which is a lot of medieval maps are sort of maps of the world in different ways.
Yeah.
He was a historian and a chronicler. He wrote several histories of England. And in the front of several of them, he appended a couple of different kinds of maps, all of which were original, stylistically original. There are several itinerary maps, which are basically like shows the route, the pilgrimage route from Canterbury to Rome.
Okay.
Which are fascinating. There's these sort of strip maps, like this line just kind of goes up the page like this, and you sort of follow it, and like it shows towns and cities and like how many days travel between different places.
So is it more kind of schematic, or so it's not like geographical or top?
No, it's kind of a straight line. It's sort of geographical.
Okay.
That seems to be a style of mapping that's entirely original to him. But the other thing that he did was he did 4 different maps of England, like just by itself. And what we assume is the last of them, because it's the most complicated, we now call the Cotton Claudius map. And it's a really complicated and fun map of England. It's very full of stuff. And it sort of goes well with his history. And it's a really interesting map visually. It's also the map I wrote my master's thesis on. So I spent quite a lot of time.
Spent a lot of time with it, yeah.
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 So it's very much my favorite.
Okay. That doesn't always happen, I should say, right? Is that sometimes something you spend a lot of time with doing research on, it is not always your favorite thing. So sometimes it's very much not. So
no, I think I've been fortunate with that in both my master's work and my doctoral work. I know a lot of people who get to the end of their doctoral dissertation and they're like, man, I never want to touch this thing again with a 10-foot pole. I am so done with this topic.
Yeah.
I wrote my dissertation on eel history and I graduated in 2020. So 5 years later, I'm still doing eel history as a significant part of my life. And I enjoy it. Like I got to the end of the project and I found that I had really liked it. I liked what I'd written. I liked the topic. It was fun. I still enjoy talking to people about it. So I'm fortunate in that.
Sometimes projects won't let go of you, like when you work on them, right? Like it's just, there are things that kind of keep pulling you back, or when you finish a project, that's when actually people read it. And so then they want to ask you about it. And so you're kind of, you kind of pulled back into it involuntarily. So I do want to ask about that specific map because I'm not like super familiar with it.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we talk about when we talk about kind of maps generally, in our teaching and stuff like that, is that maps tell stories, right, about what's included. So the fact that Matthew Paris in this particular map decided to include, as you said, kind of lots of stuff, like he couldn't include all the stuff, but the stuff he chose is very important. So what are some of those things? And like, how do you read a medieval map like that in order to kind of pull out meaning?
No, that's a good point, right? And that's a thing that's always important to remember with maps, right? We walk around with maps in our pockets all the time at this point. We're really complacent about them in a lot of ways. We tend to assume that the map is telling us an accurate story about the world. And even modern maps are not, right? They're always somebody somewhere is making decisions about what matters to show and what doesn't, how you do it and how you don't. There's a really great book about this by Marc Monnier called How to Lie with Maps. And the point that he makes is that all maps tell lies. And I'm very much sort of condensing his thesis here, but that all maps tell lies. And sometimes they are really malicious lies. Like sometimes it's people sort of bending maps to sort of show you something that's not true. Sometimes it's just a question of like what matters to you to show and how to show it. So like they tell lots of benign lies, right? Like, so if you have a map of, let's say, a river next to a train track next to a road, right? And they're all 3 running parallel to each other. If the scale of the map is far enough back, you can't actually show them at their accurate distances to each other because they'll just be right on top of each other. And so like you show space between the river and the railroad track and the road where it's not really there. Or like if you look at a highway map of the US, right? Like the highways are not actually as wide as the line would suggest that they are.
No, they are not.
Because then they would be enormous, right? So these are all sort of what Monnier in his book is calling lies. And part of that's just marketing, right? But like they're the map maker making decisions about like this is the thing that matters to me to show in this map. This is what I'm trying to get across to you. And so like there are other things that I don't care about. So there's things I'm going to leave off, or I'm going to make sacrifices to accuracy in these ways. And we always have to do that. Like I said, I initially thought I would be and trained in a lot of ways as a cartographic historian. And that's a lot of like looking at historical maps and sort of trying to parse through what the map is showing and what it's not, and what you think the map maker is trying to say, where the influences are. And one of the things I really like about maps is I think they're a great way into the past, right? Because they tell you a lot about the map maker's worldview. And
absolutely,
I mean, some people are really weird, but like presumably not just the map maker's worldview, but also a more sort of...
A lot of people are really weird, in fairness.
True. Yeah. So a more broadly popular worldview. So in the case of Paris's map, and this was the gist of my master's thesis, actually, right? Like, so he's writing a history of England, which is essentially he is critical of Henry III, but he also has really a close relationship with him. Henry comes and sits with Matthew for a while, like for about a week, to help him work through some genealogy stuff. His history of England is very much sort of a pro-Plantagenet history, and very much a history of like arguing for England's supremacy over Wales and over Scotland both, right?
Sure.
And so there are a lot of places on the map where he's included bits of legends from Geoffrey of Monmouth and things like that, and where both in the book and in the map, he's sort of trying to tie back to the Geoffrey of Monmouth ideas, sort of basically arguing for the current regime as being the inheritors of a long history of sort of ownership of the island. And the map, I think, sort of tries to make those arguments in a whole bunch of ways, in where it places specific legends, and how it shows sort of areas of control, and kind of how it talks about different spaces, and the terms that it uses, and sort of trying to line those up with how Matthew's talking about what he's talking about in the text of the book, right? And one of the things that is problematic sometimes about medieval art, like maps, is that they often get discussed out of context, whatever they're traveling with.
I was going to say, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm not the first person to have written about Matthew Paris's maps, but most of the writing about his maps doesn't really consider them like as a part of the history itself. As a historian, I would say that's maybe an art historian's, because a lot of the people who've written about him are art historians. That's a bit of an art historian's blind spot, is they want to often look at the material sort of by itself. And as a historian, my reaction is like, no, it's traveling with a thing. It's part, they go together. He did that on purpose. Let's think about why. As all the art historians turn off your show.
Just remember, guys, it wasn't me; it's my guest. So you can listen to the next one if you're. We'll try to recuperate art historians at some point in the future. No, but I think I mean I don't think historians are kind of out of the woods here, let alone kind of
no
disciplines, not by any stretch of the imagination. Because what I was going to say is that I think that's actually a really interesting development, kind of within the study of the medieval world generally, is just within kind of my career, which I've been doing this for a long time, but still, more recently, like attention to kind of codicological concerns, like how do things travel in manuscripts with other texts, but also with images and stuff like that. Like that is something that is really kind of a newer thing. I mean, there were certainly scholars who were doing this way back, when in the 19th and 20th century as well. But attentiveness to how does a map go with, or how does an image go with the accompanying text? Because, like you said, like we tend to look at medieval art specifically as just kind of like a disembodied thing, and the internet doesn't help with that, right? Like you Google medieval map or something like that, and like boom, there's the Hereford map, or boom, there's a lovely TO map, and then you have no idea of like who wrote it, who made it, you can click through and find it, but oftentimes people don't.
Right.
So, I mean, and that gets to kind of another kind of part of what I wanted to ask you about with this specific map is like, how do you talk about medieval maps specifically to make sure that people are trying to think kind of with context? So it's not just kind of explaining the map itself, but explaining kind of the text that it goes with, or the manuscripts that it's found in, and things of that nature.
Right. So my approach to sort of writing about medieval maps is not that terribly different than my approach to writing about more modern maps, which is to sort of take a part of it and basically sort of pull the thing apart to deconstruct it, right? To sort of to look at different elements of it and say, okay, here's like, we're going to look at this part of the map where he's using text from Geoffrey of Monmouth on the map to talk about the Welsh people, right?
Sure.
And then we're going to go back and look at what Geoffrey of Monmouth says, and we're going to look at what Matthew is saying in his like in the text of his history. And then we're going to think about what's going on historically, and then we're going to try to pull all those together and say, like, the reason that he's doing this is he's trying to tell you that the Welsh people suck. And that they're descended from Brutus, and the English are descended from Aeneas, and so like this is much better.
And that's always, I mean, because it's not just, and that, I mean, this is true of a lot of medieval texts and modern texts as well. Of course, is it's not just explaining the thing, right? It's explaining all the references within the thing and the kind of really complicated kind of intertextual work that they're trying to do. Because someone like Matthew Paris is just he's gonna expect his audience to just kind of understand. They're gonna be expected to know Geoffrey of Monmouth, right? Like inside and out. So like he's writing for a very specific audience that we, in the 21st century are not that audience.
Right. So, and one of the really fascinating things about that specific dynamic there, and this is a tangent, but like, so Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote about 100 years before Matthew Paris, 120 years. And, when Geoffrey launched his book into the world, contemporary historians, right, were like, no, that's just made up bullshit. But 100 years later, Matthew Paris is looking at it and being like, and using it as the grounding, like he's taking it seriously and using it as a grounding for his own history. So like that's a fascinating sort of turn to me, that like Geoffrey's contemporaries understood that he was writing historical fiction. Yeah. And some of them call him out quite explicitly on it. But 100 years down the line, and maybe because it's useful to his goals, right? Yeah. But Matthew Paris is like, yep, we're going to lean on that pretty heavily, man. Yeah.
And we talk a lot about this as all sorts of historians do that, right? Is that the thing about sources that they have lives of their own, right? That survive way past the time of their creation. And so unless there is, misinformation gets into the world very quickly. And I think every medievalist, probably every scholar, has some sort of footnote that they've tried to chase down, and it just becomes this recursive series of footnotes that just disappears into the ether, right? Like I remember very distinctly, my dissertation was on the legend of Charlemagne and like trying to track down this kind of reference to Charlemagne's legendary journey to Jerusalem, and then just like everybody was footnoting everybody else until the 19th century guy who just like said it, and there was nothing.
I was going to say it was a 19th century antiquarian, wasn't it? Who just it was a 19th century. I think he probably did this thing.
That's what Charlemagne would have done, according to me sitting in my chair in Berlin somewhere, probably. So yeah,
it's amazing how many of those there are.
So always check your sources. Yeah, so that's the lesson.
Was it Sonia Drimmer calls this the chortle muffin?
Chortle muffin?
Chortle muffin hypothesis, right? That eventually it comes back to some dude who's basically ought to be named Chortle Muffin, sitting in his posh study somewhere, like just making stuff up.
Yep.
I had that with the Eels too, actually.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah, that was part of how I got sort of interested in the Eels.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Please tell me about this. Tell me about Sir Thomas Chortle Muffin in your case. So.
Right. So I hadn't known anything at all about Eels, and I was trying to find a topic for a grad seminar final paper, right? So like a 25, 30 page paper you need to write. For grad seminar, the seminar was on sort of spatial history. Okay. So I was spending time in the map room at Cornell looking through maps to see if I could find something that that caught my interest, right? And my initial thinking, I was looking at maps of London because my initial thinking had been, the Great Fire of London's in 1666, right? Mm-hmm. And burns down like pretty much all of the old city within the walls. And then there's this really interesting period where Parliament requests a whole bunch of modern plans for the city, right? Like it's gone. So what if we just like made all these straight streets and angles and like did it like Paris, right? Well, not Paris, but Paris now. Yeah. And so they get a whole bunch of submissions from Christopher Wren and other people, and then they just ignore it and go like, basically they build the city back on exactly the same sort of street plan it had before. They just like require people to make more things out of brick and like build back from the street like 2 feet. Initially, I was really curious about that moment where like you have sort of an imagination for what the city could look like, and they're commissioning maps. And so I was curious about why they went the direction they did, and like thinking about that moment of sort of cartographic possibility, right? And the answer was, as it turned out, was pretty simple, was that like winter was coming, and they had the entire population of London out in tents in the field, and they're like, damn it, we need
some buildings.
We got to get people back in houses. Like, let's go with what we know. That's why I was looking at maps of London from like the 17th century. And I noticed on a bunch of these maps that there were these two ships on the Thames labeled eel ships. And that was really curious to me because I didn't know anything at all about eels. So that stood out to me, like, why eels? And the other thing that stood out to me is that, like we said a little bit earlier, right? Anytime you're drawing a map, you're making choices about what matters and what doesn't matter.
Absolutely.
And everything else on these maps that has a name is like a big civic monument, like the Tower of London or the Globe Theatre, or is a neighborhood.
Okay.
Right. And then you have these two ships labeled, so like they have a name, labeled eel ships. And that struck me as really odd because it says that like they've achieved some sort of landmark status that I didn't understand.
Yeah.
And that was interesting because unlike St. Paul's, these could sail away. And in fact, as it turns out, sailing away is an important part of what they do.
Yeah.
So like you have a part of the city that can leave and come back, and it's a landmark. I was curious about that. And I did a little bit of research. And what I found was that there's this really amazing story about these ships, which is that like, so they have this berth on the Thames, which they have free of charge. They're not taxed on it. And so they have this charter that says that they're not taxed as long as, and this is one of the really fun parts, as long as like the moorings don't stay vacant for like more than 2 minutes.
Oh, okay.
And so the Dutch developed this system of like, when one of the ships is empty, they have another one that's kind of waiting behind it, and they just like swap them out. And that they've been doing this for a really long time. In fact, during World War, because the ships stay on the Thames until 1938, and during World War I, the Dutch kept ships at these moorings, even though they didn't have any eels to sell anymore, because they didn't want to lose the privilege.
Yeah.
And the right to do this dates back to, well, this is where it got weird. Right.
Okay.
Because it was a right that Queen Elizabeth granted the Dutch because some Dutch merchants brought her a really nice eel, and she was so thankful that she granted them this charter.
As it happens, I guess, right? So
yeah, but it also might have been Charles II, because there's the story that like after the Great Fire of London, the Dutch had come to the rescue with a whole bunch of eels to feed the starving Londoners, and as sort of a thanks, Charles gave the Dutch a monopoly on eel sales in the city and this free mooring. But it also might have been George III. So like this is where I started like being curious.
So
right?
nobody knows, really?
Nobody knows, right? And like, but everybody asserts, like, so this shows up in a bunch of different places in modern academic histories, but always as kind of a weird sort of an aside, like a little bit of a footnote.
Yeah.
And then it's the same thing you were talking about earlier. You try to figure out where that's coming from, and you wind up just like pulling on threads, and it becomes it becomes circular. Everybody's citing somebody else who's then citing them back in, like, you're kind of going in circles.
Yeah.
This is what kind of initially caught my attention, right? Because it's you're like, okay, I'm trying to find a topic for a seminar paper, and here's a very clear like historical question. Like, I have 3 or 4 different narratives about why these ships have this charter. So I wonder if I can like work this out. And so I went and talked to the professor for the class who was on my committee as well, and I was like, look, okay, Ray, I've got 2 different topics for a paper. I've got one having to do with like thing about space and the regular arts Concordia and monastic spaces, and I know I can write that. And then I have this thing with eels, and I have no idea what's here and what isn't. And like, I'd have no idea if I can get 30 pages out of this thing. And he said, do the eels. That sounds a lot more interesting. And like, if it's 15 pages, it's 15 pages, and we'll talk about it and figure out like something else to like, it'll be fine. Like sometimes that's how historical research goes sometimes, right? Like you find a thread and you pull on it, and sometimes it keeps coming, and sometimes like it stops and you're like, oh, well, there's the answer. And it's just like, I didn't know it, but some early 20th century German historian has already done this work. But I got to the end of my 30 pages and I had more questions than answers, because as it turns out, there is no charter.
Oh.
The Dutch, in fact, paid taxes on this mooring. They never brought eels to London in the aftermath of the Great Fire. In fact, like, they were pretty happy about the Great Fire, right? Because that's right in the middle of the Anglo-Dutch Wars. The ships aren't even on the Thames at that point. They've been kicked off about 6 months earlier. And they stay gone for about 15 years. There never was a charter. Yeah. But the idea of the charter develops. And like, by the time you get to the World War I and the Dutch eel merchants sitting on the ships in the Thames, they believe it. It's like, where does it come from? And so that was kind of the question that I set out to answer. And I got to writing the dissertation, and I still wasn't thinking it would be a dissertation about eels. I was sort of thinking about, by that point, I'd spent a lot of time looking at maps of London from the 17th century. It's like, okay, well, like, there's a lot going on here. I'm interested now in writing a dissertation about like the way that space gets used and written and thought about in sort of early modern London. Sure. And I've got this thing with the eels. It's a really great intro. So I'm just like, that's how I'm going to get into this topic.
Yeah.
I started writing, but I still felt like I needed to explain why the eel ships like achieved this space of being a landmark, right, on these maps.
Yeah. Why specifically eel ships?
Yeah. And that thread just kept coming and coming and coming and coming. And like the more I pulled on it, the more there was. And the more I started looking around sort of medieval English history, the more eels. Like there are eels everywhere. They're in the art and literature and language and toponyms and metaphors. And they're just everywhere. And it's a thing that nobody had ever bothered to pull all the things together, all the eel references together in one place. And at one point, I went and had a meeting with my dissertation committee, and I was like, look, I'm 120 pages into this thing. I haven't gotten up to the point where I thought I was going to start with the ships on this map, and I've got a lot more to write about. So I think I think it's just eels at this point.
Yeah. Suddenly eels.
It's just eels, right? And this is the surprise in Surprised Eel Historian. Like I did not intend to be an eel historian. It just like one day I turned around, looked around, was like, oh, I have become one.
Sorry to interrupt myself, but I wanted to pause, take a moment, and remind everyone how this podcast will work. Every week on Wednesdays, we'll release a new episode to talk about the Middle Ages and how Americans have thought about the medieval past. And although these episodes are free to listen to, they're not free to make. So I'd be grateful if you'd head to patreon.com/AmericanMedieval to support us. You'll sleep the restful sleep of the saints for supporting a good history podcast, of course, but you'll also get some cool extras to learn more about what we're talking about in the episodes. Maybe more importantly, before we get back to the show, I want y'all to know that American Medieval is a proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. Multitude is a podcast company made up of passionate people creating shows you can count on. The shows you'll find here are all smart, funny, and just plain interesting. But maybe the thing I love most about my sibling shows is that these, like American Medieval, are all hosted by experts with the intention of inviting people in. They don't, in other words, just pass along information. Instead, they invite all of us as listeners to be part of a knowledge creation together. That's the good stuff. You'll hear more about Multitude and the specifics of all these great shows during future episodes of American Medieval. But until then, if you do want to learn more, head to multitude.productions and check these shows out for yourself. Okay, now back to the Middle Ages. Well, eels too, right? Like, are just they're not part of the American cultural imaginary, like in any way, right? Like, not even a thing. Like, I think we all have, most Americans have probably watched some sort of nature documentary and seen like a moray eel or something like that in like a scuba diving video. But like we're not talking about those eels, right?
No. And this is one of the first questions I get often from people is like, oh, you mean electric eels? Like, no, those aren't even eels, actually. It's a completely different fish, and those are just native to South America, right? Or they're thinking about moray eels. And those are the two eels that we have any sort of cultural consciousness of, right?
Yeah.
Electric eels, because like, that's weird and cool.
Yeah, exactly.
And moray eels, like among other things, because they're like flotsam and jetsam in the Little Mermaid and things like that. And I mean, we do have eels in this country, in the East Coast at least, not on the West Coast. But yeah, they're not really we don't eat them a whole lot. They're not really part of our cultural imagination so much. And so, yeah, like I said, I didn't know anything at all about eels before we started. But no, these are what we're talking about. What I wrote my dissertation on is freshwater eels. So this is which is a bit of a misnomer because they're catadromous, which means that they are born at sea. As far as we can tell, all the eels in Europe and in the Americas, in North America, are born in the Sargasso Sea, so sort of in the middle of the Atlantic. And they wind up coming to shore, and they spend most of their lives in freshwater. They live to anywhere from 10 to 20 years in the wild. And then they go back to sea to mate and die. They're critically endangered at this point. They've had like a 90+% population crash in the last 40 years. But they used to be just sort of ubiquitous in European and North American waters. Sort of estimates of historical numbers suggest that in sort of the downstream sections of rivers in North America and Europe, historically eels have made up between 25 and 50% of the fish biomass.
Wow.
So like if you took all the fish out of the water and weighed them, like 25 to 50% of that weight would be eel.
It's a lot of eels.
It's a lot of eels, right?
It's a lot of eels, yeah.
Which is, one of the things that I write about a lot on social media, and I chapter in my dissertation is on eel rents, right? This like people paying for their rents in medieval England with eels. And
so like as a current, just so we're clear, so all the readers
as
are
a
clear,
currency,
like as
yes.
a currency, they would take an eel and give it, say, I am giving you this eel in exchange for something.
Yes, and usually they are smoked and dried.
Important point, right?
Yeah,
not
right.
live.
Yeah, not live. There are a couple of rents that ask for live eels, but generally they're smoked and dried. So in 1100, there are at least, and this is like, I know there are more than this. This is how medieval records go, right? Like, this is what we know. There are at least like 540,000 eels being sort of owed in rent in England every year.
Per year. Okay.
Per year. Yeah. And that number is certainly bigger because it doesn't include Northumbria, it doesn't include London, and because we lose records all the time.
Yeah.
And like some of them are quite large. The Domesday Book, the largest rent in the Domesday Book is 75,000 eels. The village of Harmston, so like these 20 villagers in Harmston owe the Earl of Chester each year. What he does with 75,000 eels, I have no idea.
That's so many eels.
It is.
That's so many eels, especially in a population around 1,100. Like that's, wow. Okay.
Yeah. That is a gaudy number, but it is not unusual. So like King John and Henry III specifically like to order eels for their Christmas feasts. Henry ordered 30 or 40,000 at a go. So like these are really big numbers.
Yeah.
And one of the questions I get often is like, how were there any eels left? I'm like, there were so many eels, man. like this did not make a dent in the eel population. There's between 1,000 and 1,100, there's a real drop-off in a lot of other kinds of fish in England, which I think we talked about on the Drinking with Historians.
Yeah.
It's called the Fish Event Horizon, which is fun. Like,
the Fish Event Horizon, which is an amazing title. Yes.
Yeah, you get a drop-off in fish, in a lot of different kinds of freshwater fish consumption in England, and it gets replaced with like pelagic fish, so fishing from the ocean. And a lot of this has to do with the building of dams. Like they build a ton of dams for mills and things, and this gets in the way of fish migration pathways. Like, so you see a real drop off in like salmon consumption because the salmon can't get around the dams. But eels can go overland if they need to, and the elvers, little baby eels, can climb up medieval dams. It's no problem. Like they're not bothered by those at all. Modern hydroelectrical dams cause them a lot of trouble, but like medieval dams are not a big deal.
Modern hydroelectric, I would assume, being much larger than medieval dams.
Yes, much larger, and with turbines, which get in the way too.
Not as friendly to fish.
No, really not.
Yeah.
So like, there's so many eels, man. They're just everywhere. So
it's just so many eels. Yeah.
And one of the things I'll point out to people, like, okay, so that's 540,000 eels that people are paying like in taxes, but very often, like that's the eels off the top, right? That's often those are the eels that like a fisherman is paying the landlord in order to fish for other eels that he is then eating and selling.
Yes.
So like this is not considering like the entire rest of the economy, which it's not that the entire economy is eel based, but like there's a lot of them.
Yeah. It's a significant portion of the economy at the very least, right?
It is a significant portion of the economy. And one of the ways that we can tell this, like I said earlier, is that there are like eels show up in so many sort of elements of cultural production. They show up in art and literature and toponyms, and there's tons of eel metaphors. This is one of the things I found really fascinating is that you mentioned earlier that sort of Americans, as modern Americans, we don't deal with eels a whole lot. And so like we don't have a lot of eel metaphors. The only one we have still is like slimy, right? Slimy is an eel.
Yeah.
And so I think as a culture, we tend to think about eels are like, they're kind of weird. They're like snakes. They're slimy. They're kind of gross. And so the trend among historians and literary scholars looking back at historical metaphors about eels is to read them through a modern lens, which means to read them entirely negatively.
Yeah.
But as it turns out, there are negative eel metaphors, right, in medieval England, but there are also positive ones and sort of more neutral ones that like aren't good or bad. It's just like you're using the eel as a metaphor, like to speak to something else.
Were eels thought to be like cunning or anything like that, or with it? Because I'm just curious about like if they're ubiquitous, right? If they're used, I'm assuming primarily for consumption, right?
Yep.
Like for food, right?
Yes, two things. So food and also eel leather gets used for a whole bunch of things, lacing and things like that.
Oh, okay.
And an eel fat has medicinal purposes as well.
Okay. All right. So lots of like, I mean, so eels are not only ubiquitous in the fact that they're just kind of everywhere, but they're being used. So like people are like almost literally surrounded by eels in a lot of these, especially like villages like that have high proportions of fishermen or something like that.
Yeah.
So how are eels talked about or presented, like you mentioned, like artistically or culturally then?
So one of the things, this is not so much a metaphor, this is an art thing, but like one of the things that I really love is medieval English artists will try to put eels in anything with water. So like Very often people will send me like, found this eel in like the water in this artwork, and I'm like, and then I'll go look it up, and it's like, oh yeah, that's from like Oxford or Canterbury or someplace.
Yeah.
And they will do it in places where there's not otherwise eels. Like continental versions of the same kind of art doesn't include eels. Kathleen Kennedy has been working on a really interesting project looking at, it's not my project, so I do not know the specifics of it, but looking at a specific kind of art style that was really popular in Italy that then gets reproduced in England. And one of the conversations, she reached out to me because like, she's like, it seems like there's a lot of eels in these. I'm like, well, that's not surprising. Like, and it's one of the ways that you can tell like they're making the art their own is like they're putting eels in it.
Oh, yeah.
It gets tricky thinking about national identity and the medieval, right? Like it's really problematic. But to sort of be very general about it, like the medieval English thought of themselves as an eel-eating people. So they show up in the art a lot, and they show up in art in sort of some unusual ways. And one of the ways that I really enjoy is there's St. Christopher illustrations become really popular in England in like the 12th century. They get put on the walls of like parish churches a lot where they have big murals. So over the course of the 12th century, there's actually quite a lot of these that get drawn and sort of covered over other sort of cycle drawings. And there are eels in a bunch of them. And this is something which is kind of an English specific thing. You don't see this a whole lot in continental drawings of St. Christopher. So lots of eels like wrapping around his feet and going through them. And there are a handful of them, and they're all in the fens where Christopher is drawn as an eel fisherman, where he's not leaning on a staff, but leaning on an eel spear.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And you can tell because the eel spears they're serrated. So they're really unusual looking. They're serrated because eels are very slippery and they get away pretty easily. And so like you kind of, if you're fishing for them with a spear, you can't poke it once. You try to get the eel caught between the tines, and then it's serrated so it holds it there.
Right.
So there's a handful of these where like it's very clear that the idea here is like to try to make the saint seem kind of local in some ways, right?
Yeah. Is it particular to England though? Like we think of, I think, Americans sometimes think of England as the whole kind of island, but it's not, right? It's right. Welsh and, Wales and Scotland. Like were eels as big and important in Scotland and Wales as well?
So Wales, not so much. And this has partly to do with the topography. There's a ton of eels in the Severn Basin. Okay. But Wales generally is kind of mountainous, right?
Sure.
And frankly, like there are rivers and streams, but the pitch and the gradient is not super conducive to eels. So in the middle part of Wales, there really aren't a whole lot of eels because the topography is not particularly conducive to their lifestyle, right? Mm-hmm. And Scotland, there are eels in Scotland. I honestly don't know the answer to your question. And this has partly to do with like, at some point you have to draw bounds around to the research you're doing, right?
Yes. You have to finish the dissertation.
You do. And so the boundary that I drew was like, I'm going to be paying attention to eels in English, sort of cultural history here. And there are eels in Scotland. I know they show up in some places in writing, and a handful of places I could point to. Robert the Bruce really loved his eels, and his physician had a problem with that. I don't think they're quite as pervasive a part of the culture, but like that's a bit of a guess on my part, and not based on anything, actually knowing anything.
Well, it's curious too, like you were saying, is the various ways in which medieval peoples kind of constructed identity, right? Is that the idea that English thought of themselves as an eel-eating people, that it was kind of pervasive in the types of art that they were producing within kind of the Kingdom of England specifically, that this is a marker of identity, and it's not, the same as kind of, the St. George or, or anything like that, but it's part of that as well. And it's not something that oftentimes I think we think about, that people in the Middle Ages would be that multifaceted, that something like that could be part of their understanding their identity, right?
I think we go one of two ways with that, very broadly. The first is that we read modern nationalism straight back onto medieval people, right? Or at least like this is Patrick Geary's the Myth of Nations stuff, right? Like that we really want to find the origin of the modern world in the medieval, so it gives us sort of legitimacy. So we either sort of read it back wholesale onto them, or we assume that it's just the Dark Ages and like they don't know anything. But it's complicated, right? Like people are complicated, and
people are complicated. Yes. Even in the Middle Ages.
And it's, this is a conversation that I've had with students a lot, right? It's like, it is a mistake to think that medieval people were stupid, right? Like people are people, and we don't actually change a whole lot. We haven't changed a whole lot in terms of our like physical or mental capacities in the last 1,000 years. We are who we are. And like, people now like to sort of understand identity with the groups that they're around, and the medieval people did too. It's a mistake. It's easy to make, right? But like to think like because they're working from a different base of knowledge, that they are like less smart than we are.
Yeah.
And I think probably as medievalists, we've all had versions of this conversation with students, right? Where you're like, okay, so, you're reading Bede's discussion of the world, and students like, well, that's wrong. And it's like, okay, well, how do you know that? Bede knows that because like he's basing his knowledge on received knowledge. Like he's his understanding on received knowledge.
Yep.
He's asking some questions of it, but he's basically taking what the people around him, what the world understands is true, to be more or less true.
Yeah.
It's like, but you're doing that too, right? Like, how do you know that the world goes around the sun, right? Have you measured it?
Yeah.
No, like you've just been told that forever and you believe it. And like, we can prove it, but you don't know how we prove it because they almost never do. Right.
No, it's about trusted news sources, right? I mean, we live in an age of political misinformation, right? In which people get their information from certain sources, and like medieval people are the same way.
Yeah.
Like, what they think of as an authority was just different than ours. And we can understand what those authorities meant, and we don't have to accept that certain of their conclusions were true, but we can talk about them. We can understand them. So.
Yes. Yeah. But English people did think of themselves as sort of an eel-eating people, right? And one of my favorite sort of examples of this is there's a 14th century guy named Thomas Bradwardine who briefly winds up being the Archbishop of Canterbury and then dies in the Black Death. But he writes a couple of different things. But one of the things he writes is this really thin little book on how to train your memory. So mnemonic practice, which is a big deal for medieval people, right? It's a memory-based society in a lot of ways. Yep. So he walks you through, how to build a mnemonic sort of library in your head and how to use it. And there's a part in the book where he gives an example sentence and then shows you how to walk through it so you would remember each of these words. And the sentence is about the English king laying siege to the city of Berwick in Scotland. And so like he goes you through each of the words in the sentence, and he gives you lots of examples for like how you might remember the word. So for when he comes to king, he's like, okay, so if you are like me, Thomas Bradwardine, you know the king. So like, cool, that's really easy, right? So I just think about Edward and we're good to go. But if you're not me, then maybe you know somebody in your village named King, or like there's a guy who dressed up as a king for Halloween or something like that, right? So he gives you a bunch of, and for each of the words he does this, except for England. The only thing he tells you about England is eels. He says, if you want to remember England, think about eels.
Yeah.
And that's really telling to me because like it's the only word in the sentence where he just gives you one. And the only reason he gives you one is because you should know it. And there is a pun there, right? Like he's making a pun with anguilla is the Latin word for eel. So he's making this like pun with English and anguilla. But there's more to it than that. Like I think he doesn't think he needs to give you anything else because you should just know it. It's like, yeah, we're the people who eat eels, man.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really interesting that I think that, I mean, the memory stuff is so interesting in its own way, but the fact that he thought that his audience would immediately be just like, oh,
yeah, of course. Sure.
Eels, England. Yeah, sure. Makes sense. Like we were talking about everywhere, like pervasive. They're in the streams, they're in the rivers, they are surrounding us, the leather is on us in many cases, like, and they're, rents are being paid to them, especially if you're a nobleman. Right, you're receiving some rents and eels almost certainly, then that's just kind of what it is. So it's not the way that I would think about medieval England, but it is, I guess, a way that the medieval English themselves were thinking about themselves. So yeah,
I think so. And one of the things that I have to be careful about for myself is like not to overplay it. Right? Like my work is all about eels. And so I have a tendency to be like, it's all about eels, man. And of course it's not. Like this is a really small part of the culture. It just happens to be the one that I've looked at and sort of pulled all the pieces together and been like, hey, we should be thinking about this too. That's the thing I think about sometimes, especially given where we are right now culturally with the way that politicians often talk about like historical research, right? Like you pick out the ridiculous sounding things and you hold them up to the light and be like, can you believe that we are wasting money on like somebody who's just like trying to think about medieval eels or whatever, right? Like any individual dissertation topic, any individual monograph, you can hold up in Congress and be like, this is so niche and so ridiculous. Like, what is even the point? The point is not the individual work, right? Like the point, I mean, as much as any of us want to believe that our individual work really matters, right? But like culturally, broadly, it's not that I have this very niche thing, or you have this very niche thing, and that's what matters. It's that, like the metaphor I use sometimes is like each of them is a grain of sand, essentially, right? Individually, that doesn't really get too much, but you start putting them together and you get enough of them, and then suddenly like you've got a beach, right?
Yeah.
That's how we build knowledge, is like these little tiny niche things at a time. And like, I don't expect other people in the world to care about like the Latin translations of Chronicles or Kitchener's books or things like that. That's my job.
Yeah.
But they can take away the bigger picture, right? And like, so like this is a lot of the work that I do with social media, is like taking the really rigorous academic work that I did for my dissertation and making it sort of publicly consumable in ways that will sort of stick with people's memory a little bit.
No, and I think that, I mean, that makes so much sense. And I think that's a really great way of putting it, is that each individual's contribution to any type of scholarship, right? Like, not everybody has to do everything. Like, the part is the fact that we are working together in a community and that we can benefit from each other's expertise means that like you can understand eels and I can sit here very comfortably not knowing a goddamn thing about eels like at all, right?
You don't have to,
because I can learn from you. That's right. Like I can just ask you questions about eels if I have them. So we are just about out of time, but I do have one more question. I want to go back to the time machine, if that's okay, because something you mentioned earlier is that, okay, so you have a time machine, you get to go back, you get to talk to kind of a younger version of yourself. And this time you have to tell them that you're the guy that if somebody finds a picture of an eel on the internet, they email it to and ask you what you think about it. So what does younger you say to that?
Yeah, I've thought about that before too. Younger me would be like, why? Like, I don't, like, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that?
But here you are, right?
Yeah, so, and yet here I am. That is exactly who I am. There was The Onion did a thing yesterday or the day before about sort of an eel with RFK's face on it. And
I saw that, yes.
Yes, and it's like, I saw that in the morning, like, oh my God, I'm going to get people tagging me with this all day long.
And I'm sure you were correct. Yes.
I was. And that's okay. That's okay. It means people care. I hope.
That's right. I was indeed even thinking about you yesterday because I just finished on Netflix. There's a show called Bodkin, which is like kind of a procedural, right? And one of the things is like this is not too much of a spoiler if you haven't seen it, but like there's kind of an illegal eel trade going on as well. And I was thinking like, oh, John Wyatt, like. Yeah, here we are in 2024 Ireland, talking about illegal eel trade.
Yeah. So younger me would have been really surprised and sort of not understood why, and that's partly to do with not knowing anything about eels,
of course,
but also partly to do with kind of what we were talking about a minute ago, and where I kind of started that conversation when you asked me the first time, right? It's like the way that I understood how history worked and what the job of a historian was and what history looked like was really different when I was 7 or 8 than it is now, right?
Of course.
I would say that there are some similarities, though, because I still like to think of historians as storytellers, because I feel like it doesn't matter how good your research is. Like, if you can't convey that to people, then like it winds up not doing much good at all. So I think the storytelling element still holds, but like I wouldn't have been surprised. Well, maybe a little surprised that you could make a living as a medievalist, but I would have thought that was really cool. I would have been really shocked that like that meant knowing more than anybody else in the world about the medieval English eel trade.
The specifics, the details of that. Yeah, that's
wouldn't have seen that coming.
No, absolutely not. So, well, here we are. So thank you so much for joining me today. So if people do want to find out more about medieval eels, where can they find you on the internet?
Right. So I actually still keep a Twitter account that I only do eel tweets on, and I don't use it for anything else because it's a dumpster fire, but there are still people there who enjoy their eel tweets. And so like I kind of keep that active to that degree, but mostly I'm on Bluesky as a social media platform. Some people use multiple social media platforms, but like, man, I don't have that kind of time. So that's where I still do a historical eel post every weekday. I've been doing that for like 6 years or so at this point.
It's a lot of eel facts.
It is. They repeat after a while, but
Fair enough. Yeah.
But somebody new can learn them. That's fine.
That's right.
So that, and the other thing, I'm going to make a pitch here for my business.
Please do.
As much as I love the eels and I love history, I don't have a job as a historian because those don't really exist so much anymore. But what I do is I draw maps on commission, custom maps. I have maps in the 2 books behind you, actually. Bright Ages and Oathbreakers.
Great books from what I hear.
Yeah, I hear good things about them. Actually, I've read them both at this point. They're both quite good. Yeah, so I draw custom maps on commission. Most of the maps that I do are for academic monographs, but I do lots of other maps too. My company name is Surprise Deal Mapping, which you set up at the top, and I have a website with examples of my work and contact information and things like that. So if any of your listeners need a map for a present or a map for a book they're working on or anything else, then I would be happy to talk to them.
SurpriseDealMaps.com. All right. Well, thank you again, John Wyatt. It's been a real pleasure. I hope that, our listeners, at the very least, if they've got nothing else out, is that the next time they see an eel or think about an eel, you'll get a new email. So, or an eel mail? Maybe?
Eel mail.
There you go. So, all right. Nothing but dad jokes. All right. Here we go. Yeah. Well, thank you again for joining us. Please join us next week, and we'll be talking about more medieval stuff. And until then, we'll talk to you soon. Thanks again.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and this episode was edited by Julia Schifini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/AmericanMedieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.